Gresham College presents The Roman Denarius and Euro, a Precedent for Monetary Union by Dr. Andrew Burnett FBA.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Gresham College. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the trustees and fellows and a former professor of commerce. And it's a real delight today to have a lecture that takes an extremely long view of commerce. It's almost incumbent, I think, when you're looking at something like the denarius to refer back to Suetonius. Suetonius tells us that in the 1st century AD, Vespasian's son, Titus, was giving him a little bit of grief about the tax that had been placed on urinals in Rome. And Vespasian held up a coin and said to him, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, basically challenging Titus to care very much where the money came from. But I would contend actually that money does smell. We today tend to refer to money strictly what is really fiat currency, or basically we tend to trade tax scrip. But money smells as well about the future. Gresham College has had a lot of interest in an initiative called Long Finance, and in 2010 we brought out a book somewhat related to today's lecture, which you can find online, In Search of the Eternal Coin. So we have a great interest in money over the ages. And the denarius is, of course, one of the most interesting. Anytime you're watching one of those spaghetti westerns and the Mexican says, mucho dinero, that's exactly what he's referring to. And it turns up in many cultures, and not least of which, those of you who are old enough to remember, which I'm not really, pound, shillings, and pence. So L, S, and D. So we can have that. So definitely a long finance view of history. And further, the denarius is particularly interesting in social policy, because Rome, possibly one of the very first major social enterprises, was to create Roman citizens. And so if you'd served your time in the army, which about 60% of the legionnaires succeeded in reaching pensionable age, they were given as a lump sum 14 years' worth of denarii in one bag, about sort of £750,000 in modern terms. And this was so that they would build their agricola, their farm, and they would become proper Roman citizens. So the denarius is very, very important. So it encompasses, I think, in many ways, a long finance view of history, but in some ways, I think, our values and fears for the future. Now, who better to take us through this, but also, I think, most importantly, to make it relevant to the modern euro crisis, is Dr. Andrew Burnett. Now, Andrew is not just the Deputy Director at the British Museum, but a renowned numismaticist. I think I got through that quickly. Won't try and do that one again. And his major research has been a 2-volume Roman provincial coinage, but he's working on his 3rd volume, which is moving him into the 2nd century. So we'll be looking forward to him speaking here in about 20 years on modern coinage at some point. Andrew's going to take us through this, but I think one of the nicest things for those of us who are Gresham College community members is Andrew is serving a lot of time as a trustee of Gresham College and is doing this really, I think, to contribute yet more to Gresham College and what we'd like to cover. Would you please join me in welcoming Andrew Burnett?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Miller, for that very warm and generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to give a talk here at Gresham College. It's a great pleasure to be associated with Gresham College, a wonderful organisation. And although this is my first lecture here, I hope indeed it won't be my last, but of course that will all depend on the feedback that you give to the authorities here. So I feel a bit nervous. Now, we all know that history is often used to justify the present. And it's a strange characteristic of human beings that they often wish to appeal to history to justify things that are going on today. One could give a lecture on that topic alone, and indeed what I'm going to say will be about one aspect of that. Now, I'm not sure myself that necessarily, we all say that history teaches us lessons that we should learn today. It does teach us lessons, but the present is always different from the past, and that indeed will be one of my themes today. So history is only ever of limited value for understanding, let alone justifying the present. However, in those heady days, not so long ago, when the euro was created, there was indeed much talk about the Roman precedent to justify the creation of the new monetary union in basically Europe. For example, this slide sets out the text you could find in this brochure that was produced at the introduction of the Europe, and makes the very clear link and clear justification between what the community leaders thought they were doing then and as they saw it, the honourable Roman past which could justify it. And it's a view that persists in many different publications, many different views, right to the present day. The most recent quotation I could find from last year, again, we have the same assumption that what has happened in Europe today is in some ways the successor of what the Romans did 2,000 years ago. Well, I feel I have to show one or two slides to begin with of the euro itself, not because they're particularly beautiful coins, some of them, if any amongst you are coin collectors as well as students of history or ancient monetary history. I'm sure many of you have been disappointed by some of the designs, but it's quite a successful idea that's spread across many parts of Europe. This is the last map, and as you know, some other countries are still, and I believe they still are, trying to join, remarkably so, given what's happened in the last few years. And the whole set is 20 different states, 17, as it were, serious states, and 3 mini-states at the bottom right, San Marino, Liechtenstein, and so on. And in fact, although I personally am no great fan of the designs used on many of these coins, they have become very rapidly collected by large numbers of collectors. Of course, you can do the maths, a number of different denominations, a number of different countries. There's a very ready market has been created by the minting authorities in Europe by introducing this coinage. 2 of my favourites, which I have to say I do quite like, are the one from Greece on the right, copying the ancient owl, the ancient tetradrachm of Athens, the bird sacred to Athena, the patron deity, and I also particularly like this one on the right from Finland, which somehow, those of you who've been to the northern parts of Finland, conveys the slightly desolate but bleak and wonderful nature of northern Finland. Anyway, that was just in case any of you didn't know what a euro looked like. I want to come on now to the Roman Empire, and I want to divide this talk into 4 parts. I'm going to discuss 4 propositions about the theme of monetary union in sequence. And the first is that for most of the 500 years of its existence, the currency of the Roman Empire wasn't unified, it was diverse. And the second point will be that although the Romans could have unified it if they wanted to, they didn't. Thirdly, that indeed there are signs that they actually tried to maintain its diversity, to stop it becoming unified. And then fourthly, but nevertheless, despite all this, it did become unified in 2 separate stages, 200 years apart, one in the western part of the Roman Empire in about AD 50, and the other in the eastern part of the Roman Empire in about AD 250. But in neither case was that unification brought about by the action of the government, Vespasian or one of the other emperors. So, and as you'll get, if I can demonstrate these 4 points, it clearly does slightly undermine the case for the euro, the denarius, as the obvious justifying precedent for the denarius. So we'll start with Roman coins. And what were they? Well, Roman coins were made in a number of different shapes, forms, and metals. There was the Roman gold coin, the Roman Denarius, of which this slide shows us actually one of the first hoards deposited in Britain after the Roman invasion of AD 43. It's a hoard from a place called Bredgar in Kent, which may or may not have been on the line of the Roman march from the landing in AD 43 towards to London. Presumably, the hoard was buried by some fairly rich, as it was gold hoard, member of the Roman army who perhaps died in one of the battle skirmishes around that time of the invasion, and hence was unable to recover the hoard until it was found today. Gold coins were the most valuable, and they were accompanied by a series of other denominations. The silver coin, the denarius, the top left, the silver coin. These are all coins of the Roman Emperor Nero of about AD 60. And then a number of base metals, loosely called bronze denominations, which actually consisted of coins made of two different metals, of brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc, and of pure copper. So the three on the middle right, as it were, the sestertius, the dupondius, and below it the semis, and the two on the right, on the left, which are made of copper, are the as and the quadrans. So the as, so the monetary system, there are 25 denarii to one gold coin, denarius. There are 4 sestertii to a denarius, 2 dupondii to a sestertius, 16 asses to a denarius, and then the semis and quadrans at the bottom are the half and quarter of the ass. The designs on these coins were often very varied. In the imperial period, they nearly always had the Roman emperor like this, but before the imperial period, in the period of the Roman Empire, they could have Roman Republic, for the last 2 centuries BC. They could often have strikingly strident designs, such as this extraordinary coin produced by Brutus, the tyrannicide, one of the two who killed Caesar, showing on the back an inscription referring to the Ides of March, the very day in which they killed Caesar, the 2 daggers with which they killed him, and this round thing in the middle, which is actually a peleus, which was a symbol of liberty. When you freed a slave, you put on this leather cap, a peleus on his head, as a symbol of liberty. So here we are with, as it were, a striking representation of the murder of Caesar. Even though, ironically, one of the things Caesar did, which he was criticised, was to put his head on the coins, as it were, a regal act, not appropriate in a democratic society, but nevertheless, despite Brutus is celebrating the end of that reign of Caesar, he nevertheless repeats the same act of putting his own image on it. So the Roman Empire, in the time of the early empire, around about Trajan, AD 100, was, a point we might come back to, was in part similar to the area of the modern European Union. But it wasn't at all the same, and I think that is an important point. I think one of the reasons why the Romans have been cited as a justifying precedent for the euro is the notion that somehow Europe today is geographically coextensive with the Roman Empire. And this obviously slide shows you very clearly that it wasn't. There's the whole of the North African strip, and then the eastern part of what is now Turkey, and indeed the Middle Eastern countries, and Iraq as well, which was part of the Roman Empire for a short time. And within this over empire, as I say, there was the Roman monetary system, which I've just described, and these, again, just to reprise the different denominational structure amongst them. And this is what you read in all the books, but of course, what actually is the case was much more complicated, as we shall now see in a minute. So again, just to run through the different elements of the monetary system, we've already discussed the gold coin, the aureus. This is another example of the Emperor Nero, minted around about 60 AD. Now I think the Roman gold coin, the aureus, has perhaps a better claim to be a precedent for the euro than the denarius, because finds of Roman gold coins like this are made pretty much throughout the entire territory of the Roman Empire. The one area, which there's some dispute about, is Roman Egypt, which had a very peculiar currency system, which we'll come back to in a minute. But nevertheless, it does seem that the Roman gold coin was indeed acceptable throughout any part of the Roman Empire. When we come on to silver, however, the question gets more complicated. I'm not going to talk very much here about the denarius, which I've already mentioned. The denarius was the staple silver coin in the western part of the Roman Empire, the ones we saw earlier of Nero and of Brutus. But that was far from being the case in the eastern part of the empire, that's to say the bit, as it were, drawing a line north-south from the Adriatic to Libya to the east of that line. Here we find a very diverse silver, and as we'll see in a minute, bronze form of currency. Because what the Romans did, and it was one of the characteristics of the success of the Roman Empire, was that when they took over an area, they absorbed many of its institutions, many of the activities there, rather than trying to impose a new Roman order on everything. And one such instance was coinage. So these coins, which we call today cistophori, because they have a cista, a box, which is the Latin for a box on one side. They are coins that bear boxes. These are their ancient names. Were made in Asia, the Roman province of Asia, which is roughly what you would call modern Western Turkey. And coins like this were made before the Roman period in this Roman province, or later the Roman province of Asia, and they celebrate the god Dionysus with the box and the snake coming out of it, and the god Heracles with the quiver and snakes, because the kings of Pergamum, who were the rulers of what was later the Roman province of Asia, claimed descent from those two gods. And when the Romans took over the area, which they did not by conquest, but because it was left to them in the will of the last king of Pergamum in 133 BC, they also took over the coinage. And what you're seeing here is a coin made while the kings of Pergamum were in charge of the kingdom, and the one below, a coin produced when what was previously the kingdom of Pergamum had become the Roman province of Asia. And as you can see, there are not many visual clues to the difference between them. If you didn't, the coinage of this period has been carefully reconstructed by scholars who've analysed the sequence of coins produced and established dates that can be attached to it. So they've been able to work out that these were made after 133 BC. But as I say, there's no suggestion of Roman iconography. The inscriptions are still in Greek and so on. These were very curious coins made in Asia, the province of Asia, and they only circulated within the Roman province of Asia. They weren't fine silver, they were made of debased silver, and that seems to be in the mechanism that kept them within that area. That's say the silver of them was less than the silver of the equivalent, which was actually 3 denarii in other parts of the empire. A similar pattern can be found in the area of Cappadocia, which is at the other end of modern Turkey here, where again we find silver coins made of their own size and denominations. There are a few of them, these ones, which are actually unusual coins for the place and period, do give us a clue by having inscriptions on them telling us what their value was. So this one says AS for ass, Italian ass, and then the Greek numerals K and delta 24, and then the half piece that says AS, IT, IB, which is 12. And it's interesting that the people who made these coins felt they had to tell people that they were such unusual denominations that they had a value of this. And it's interesting that they use this term Italian. Well, how strange that they're referring to coins in the Roman Empire of coins being tariffed in Italian asses as if it's some sort of foreign country, even though it's all part of the same empire. Then again in Syria, the Roman area of Syria, which is roughly the modern area of Syria plus Lebanon plus Israel, Again, a different system, a silver tetradrachm, a much larger silver coin, again sometimes based, usually with the portrait of the emperor and an eagle on the back. And again, these coins circulated only within the Roman province of Syria. Finally, Roman Egypt, which, as I mentioned before, had its own what's called closed currency system, like some of these other areas. The silver coins here showing the Roman Emperor Augustus and his successor, deified Augustus after his death, and his successor Tiberius in about AD 20. Again, were made of base silver and only circulated within the Roman province of Egypt, roughly the same as modern Egypt, where they were accompanied by a series of bronze coins, which again only circulated in the Roman province of Egypt. When, as we know from one or two written records, if you arrived in Egypt, you had to change your money into Egyptian money before you could buy anything. It's just like, going, as it were, for us going to Europe today. We have to get euro currency, and of course, just as now, then the bankers, the money changers, would take a hefty commission for doing so. So already we can see the silver coinage of the Roman Empire was quite diverse. And that's even more true of the bronze coinage of the Roman Empire. This is not a very beautiful map, which shows the numbers of individual cities, not provinces, but individual cities, which went on minting coins in their own name under the Roman Empire. Many in the West, some in the West, and particularly in the East. And as I said, we'll find a difference in the pattern between the West and the East in a minute. Just to give you a flavour of what some of these coins are, we saw earlier those big coins of Nero with the standard designs and types minted at Rome for circulation in much of the Western Empire up here. But many of these, I say, local coinages produced by up to several hundred different cities in the course of the Empire had very individualised designs. Here they often have, again, the portrait of the emperor, but with the accompanying inscription in Greek. This is from modern Turkey, which was part of the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. So it says Nero and Kaiser, Nero the emperor. And then on the back, an inscription you can just read a bit of in Greek, tied Dionysus, who would have been some local magnate at the city that produced it, that is then identified by the inscription Hierapoliton of Hierapolis, modern Pamukkale, where those of you who've been there know quite a nice wine is made today. And a design that depicts a local god, a local manifestation of the god Apollo. And you find literally hundreds of these designs produced by, as I say, hundreds of cities in this part of the world. Sometimes they have really quite startling designs, such as this one from a place called Apamea, which is also in modern Turkey, which has one of the earliest depictions of Noah's Ark, where you can see here is the Ark, one or two specimens. You can't quite read it on this one, have Noah in Greek. And here's Noah and his wife, and here they are coming out after the flood, and there's the dove fluttering off. This is probably because there was a Jewish community near Apamea which was celebrated on the coinage. And one of my favourites from a place called Abydos, which is on the Dardanelles, that narrow strip of land between, at the north of the Aegean up towards Istanbul, which shows this charming scene of the hero and Leander, the lovers, and there he is. He had to swim across the Dardanelles to see her. Here he is swimming across the Dardanelles, and she's in this little tower, lighting his way with a little lamp, and just to help him is a little Cupid with a torch. So it's very characteristic of the quite lively but very, as I say, specific sort of coins that were produced at these places. So lots of different places producing their own coins, lots of different designs, and rather surprisingly to us, different denominations, not just the denarius and the ass, but here, as we can see clearly on some coins of the island of Chios in the Aegean, there's coins made in the period of the Roman Empire with different denominations. We've got some labelled Assarion, which is the Roman ass that we saw earlier, but some which have a different denomination, Obolos and Obol, which was an earlier Greek denomination, which nevertheless survived into the Roman period, like some of the forms of coinage itself. And clearly we can work out that they found some system of accommodating these two systems, but nevertheless there was no attempt to, as it were, deny one system, no attempt to just maintain the Roman system at all costs. One or two traces, again, in other areas of the Roman Empire, this from Sidon, which is modern Sidon, and here we have eta, which is the Greek letter 8, and then an X, which will be the first two letters of Chalkoi, again, an earlier pre-existing Greek denomination that continued into the reign not only of Augustus, but it and its bigger denomination, the obol that we saw a minute ago, continued much later, right into the 3rd century AD, as we can see in this coin of Seleucia, which is just at the top, where the Mediterranean turns round towards Turkey. Here you can see it says ob, for obolos, and then theta, the Greek numeral for 9, 9 obols. So the system continued long into the period of the Roman Empire. So that's my first point, that the Roman system of currency was in fact enormously diverse. It wasn't unified at all. My second point is that if the Romans had wanted to unify it, they certainly could have. There would have been no difficulty whatsoever. And the evidence for this is various, partly generally what we know about the Romans. We also have a passage in a Roman author, Cassius Dio, when he describes a conversation held between the two great advisors of the Roman Emperor Augustus, who you see here, in about BC 27, Maecenas and Agrippa, where they discuss a number of things for the regulation of the future empire. And one of the ideas that they discuss is the idea that none of the cities of the empire should use their own coins, weight, or measures, but they should all use Roman ones. And again, it's quite interesting, the language that's used here is whether they should use their coins and weights or whether they should use ours, again, as if they're foreign communities within the same empire. Very occasionally, the suppression of currency did take place. Rome's great enemy, Carthage, with whom she fought 3 great wars in the 3rd century and 2nd century BC, was finally conquered in 146 BC by the Romans, and it was a very difficult relationship between the two. I mean, war is bad enough anyway, but it was particularly bitter fighting between the two sides. And you'll probably remember the Romans got so fed up that they, at all costs, Carthage had to be destroyed. Carthago delenda est, as Cato, the great Roman censor, used to thunder. Well, part of the destruction of Carthage after the final defeat in 146 BC was the physical destruction of the city, although how effective that was is a matter of dispute, but also the physical destruction of the coinage of Carthage, of which you have an example here, perhaps slightly earlier than the period we're talking about, and its replacement with Roman denarii of the type, this one fortuitously with the name Cato on it, not the famous Cato that I just mentioned. So there are 1 or 2 examples like this of how the Romans could obliterate the coinage of a hated enemy if they wished to. But normally, as I say, they didn't choose to. They choose to maintain the form of currency that had been in existence before. And this is despite the inconvenience it caused, because not only, as I say, was it this language of our Roman Italian on the one side, their foreign on the other side, suggests a conceptual difference, but as I say, there were real practical problems that when you went from one province to another, you had to change your money. And there are plenty of references, as I alluded to earlier, one in the letters of Cicero, for example, of people complaining at the commission they were charged to convert coinage from one to the other. However, it's the conceptual difference I want to come back to later in this talk, because I think that's quite important for our understanding of the ideology sitting behind these coins. So the Roman coinage was very diverse. The Romans could have ended that diversity at any time if they wanted to, but they chose not to. And then, as I said, the third part of this talk, they actually tried to promote and continue the diversity of the coinage in some areas. And I'll give a couple of examples. One could do more. One interesting area is in northern Spain, ancient Iberia, where in the course of the 2nd century BC, that's after the Roman conquest, which took place in the Second Punic War just before 200 BC, so 50 years later, we find springing up at a number of cities and communities the production of coins both in silver, with the same weight and fineness of the Roman denarius we saw before, and also of bronze. And these designs are broadly similar in the approximately 100 communities or cities that produce them. They tend to have this bearded head, whose identity is a matter of great dispute, not a terribly interesting dispute, but great dispute. And on the backside, a horseman riding with a lance, and underneath an inscription in ancient Iberian script, which is what they used in that part of the world, referring to the particular community that produced it. This one referring to Osca, which is modern Huesca. Now, the fact that 50 years after the imposition of Roman rule, something like 100 communities start producing broadly identical coins really can't be an accident. At the very least, it must have had the tolerance of the Roman authorities, but the fact that so many communities start producing so many more or less identical coins at the same time does suggest that perhaps it were Roman influence is much more present than just tolerance, that they're, as it were, actively encouraging the creation of this local but yet diverse coinage in this part of Spain. And we can find, as I say, one or two other examples of, as it were, the Romans encouraging the production of local coinage in other parts of their empire. I referred to the coinage of Roman Syria earlier, where most of the coinage was produced, as I say, as these large silver tetradrachms at the ancient mint of Antioch. And we can see here an example of the Roman Emperor Philip of the 3rd century. This one actually says, for those of you who can read Greek, Antiochia, made at the mint of Antioch. And then there are also coins of a very different style. You can see the head of the emperor is very different from these two, which have a different ascription. Instead of saying Antiochia, this says Mon Urb, which stands for Moneta Urbis, which means mint of the city of Rome. So these coins were made at the city of Rome and then sent to Syria, to Antioch, to be put in circulation as a way, as it were, of the Roman authorities supporting the local diverse coinage of this part of the world. Well, one could give more examples of that, but I think, again, that's sufficient to demonstrate the third point I wanted to make, which was that the Romans not only could have, did not stop the local coinage, even though they could have, but did nevertheless also try to maintain its diversity. So I want now to turn to, in many ways, the most interesting point, even though it's in two chronological parts, of how the Roman imperial currency did become unified. As I say, it took place in two stages, approximately 200 years apart. One in the Western Empire in about AD 50, and the areas we're talking about are Spain, province of Africa, Gaul, also a little bit Britain, Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily, quite opposed to which is the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, as opposed to the Greek-speaking part over here. And I think the language is an important factor in what follows. So in the years of the 1st century AD, we find the production of coinage in the western part of the empire starts to dry up. This is the local coinage produced at these cities of the type we saw earlier. And here's a little table. You can see in the Roman Augustus, 27 BC to AD 14, there's quite a lot. Tiberius, 14 to 37 AD, there's still quite a bit. Caligula, short reign, 37 to 41. There's only a few places all in Spain. And then there's one solitary issue, local issue, under the Roman Emperor Claudius in about AD 50 from, of all places, Eleusis, one of the Balearic Islands, modern Ibiza. So next time you're lying on the beach in Ibiza, you can console yourself as it was the place of the last minting of Western local coinage in the Roman Empire. So how did this change come about? Well, there have been various theories to explain the change. Sometimes it's said it was a political change, that the Roman emperors decided that they were to stop making their own coinage in these parts of the world and start using Roman coins of the sort we saw earlier. But that won't really work, because we've just seen the gradual change in the pattern. If the Romans had, as it were, decided that the pattern was going to stop, it would have stopped pretty much straight away, just as we saw in the previous examples of when they wished to do something, it would happen very fast. So direct political intervention can't explain the gradual change. A second sort of explanation has been given in terms of an economic explanation. It's said that the Roman provinces in the west were so much more impoverished than those in the rich east that they were unable to afford to go on minting their own coins. But this argument won't work either, really, for two reasons. One is that the production of bronze coinage is not a significant cost in antiquity, that it would not have had any significant financial onus on the city producing the coins to do so. And secondly, anyway, there isn't really any evidence, in fact there's no evidence, that the provinces of the Roman West were any less rich than those of the Roman East. So if neither of those two perhaps more obvious types of argument will work, how can we explain this change? And the explanation that I think we should think in terms of is rather than political or economic, but as a sort of cultural phenomenon that, as it were, is an inclination of the communities in the West to use Roman coinage rather than to go on making their own coinage. And one can see some evidence to support this view that it was a cultural choice to make this change in the pattern of coinage from the coins themselves. Because some of them start to look very like Roman ones, even while their production is still going on. Here, for example, we have two coins, one from the Mint of Rome on the left, the dark one, and one from the Mint of Caesar Augustus, Zaragoza, in Spain. And they both depict Agrippa, Augustus' great admiral. And going back to this one, you can see the style, the inscription, the depiction are pretty much exactly the same. It's only the back, which identifies the mint, that is different. Another example, a more recently discovered one, at the city of Cavaca. At the top, a coin depicting the Emperor Caligula, around AD 40, with on the depiction on the back his three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia. Again, a very close copy of this other coin, Sestertius, minted at Rome, the Mint of Rome, by the emperor himself. So the communities are starting to make coins. In the West, the communities are starting to make coins that look like Roman coins. And as well, it's quite a short step to just using Roman coins and not making their own. And indeed, when a few years later, a branch mint is set up by the Roman Empire Nero at Lyon in southern France, the coins are identical. The ones at the top were made at the Mint of Rome, the ones at the bottom were made at the Mint of Lyon. It's only this little globe here at the end of the neck that distinguishes them. And if you study the distribution, you can find these ones are found in Northern Europe and these ones are found in Southern Europe. And not only the official coins become identical, but a lot of imitation coins were made at the same time in the Western provinces, and they too copy the mint coins made at the city of Rome. These coins of the Emperor Claudius at the top, and then a very crude imitation at the back, at the bottom, which might have been made in Britain, Gaul, Spain. We find such examples throughout that territory. Can copy the Roman coin from the Mint of Rome. They don't copy the earlier locally made coins. So that can provide some sort of explanation for this change, how the coinage of the Roman West became unified. What about the why should it only have been in the Roman West? Well, obviously the West was different from the East. I mentioned the language factor. Latin was the language of the West, Greek the Latin of the East. And I think this is part of a series of fundamental differences between the West and the East, even though one empire, two very different parts. People had different aspirations. People in the Western Empire clearly felt to be more part of the Roman state than people in the eastern part of the empire, and whole areas in the West sought political privileges like Roman citizenship, which communities in the East didn't follow. In the East, what we find is communities competing against each other. That, as it were, the city of Leeds wants to be more important than the city of Glasgow, not that they both want to be cities in the United Kingdom. And that's the analogy. The West would be cities in the United Kingdom, the East would be Leeds against Glasgow or whatever. So I chose those examples at random. I apologise if I've offended anyone. So here, for example, coins of Pergamum, sorry for the typo in the caption, in modern Turkey. Pergamum is showing off how important it is by having 3 imperial temples based in its city, more than any other city could manage. The cities are competing with each other. They want to be the first city of a province. One proudly boasted it was the 7th city of the province. That was so important relatively. And this is a very different sort of ideology from that we find in the West, where, as I say, the cities, people in the cities wanted to be part of the bigger whole, the Roman Empire. And I think that's what explains the change taking place in the West, but not taking place in the East. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, the change did take place in the East slightly later, in about AD 200. Sorry, I'm going wrong here. AD 250. And again, this rather unclear diagram shows how the pattern of minting in the eastern part of the empire did change. Here we've got time from the first Roman Emperor A, Augustus, to one at the end of the 3rd century, Tacitus, so about 0 BC to 270 AD. And here we have a scale that shows the number of cities, not the volume of coinage, but the number of cities making coins in each of these emperors. And you can see it goes down a bit, then it goes up, a peak under the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus in around about AD 200, where we have almost 400 cities minting, and then 1 or 2 peaks and troughs, and eventually it goes down and declines and comes to an end at around about AD 270. So how do we explain that? This extremely ugly coin has again the distinction of being the latest local coin produced anywhere in the Roman Empire. And again, some of you may have visited Perga, like Ibiza, on your holidays. I hope so. Again, it has an interesting numismatic history. So what brought about this change? Well, what brought about this change was indeed the inflation that hit the Roman Empire of the 3rd century AD. Under the various crises of the 3rd century AD, the Roman state began to run out of money. It was, in some measure, overrun by invaders from the east. Parts of the west seceded. So, for example, around about AD 260, the whole of Britain, Gaul and Spain formed a separate so-called Gallic Empire. Well, around about the same time, much of the east, Turkey, Syria, formed part of more or less independent empire based in Palmyra. So the empire was under enormous threat, and it had to spend a lot of money to try and defend its borders, and it just literally didn't have enough money, enough bullion, gold and silver, to make enough coins to pay enough soldiers to defend its boundaries. So what happened was that very rapidly the Romans started debasing their silver coinage from 80 or 90% pure, very rapidly down to about AD 270 to no more than 1 or 2% pure. But yet the official face value of the coins remain much the same. Denarius, or later its double piece, the Antoninianus. And as a result of that, as it were, the face value of the bronze coins, which of course were subsidiary to the silver coinage, became more and more depressed, and they ended up having a face value that really wasn't worth anything. Just like in our modern world, coins such as the halfpenny eventually falls out of use because its purchasing power is so small. And that's what brought about this change. There was one, after Tacitus, there was one final gasp in Egypt, which had its own, own currency system, which went on a little bit longer to the Roman Empire Diocletian, and then was brought into the system of unified coinage, replacing the denarius that was introduced by the Roman Emperor Diocletian in about AD 300. And Diocletian set up a whole series of network of mints across different parts of the empire. The tendency had begun a little bit earlier with Aurelian, but under Diocletian there was a much more developed system of mints. I'm sorry for the question here, it's left over from another lecture. The answer, as of course you all know, is the mints were somewhere near the frontier, so they'd be able to pay the soldiers nearby. But all these mints at last produced coinage of a uniform sort. These are all depicting the Roman Emperor Diocletian around about AD 300, and they all have the same reverse design, this genius figure with the inscription Genio Populi Romani, to the genius of the Roman people. And they all have mint marks, which are helpful because they tell you where they're made. Lund for London. We haven't actually discovered where the Mint of London was, but obviously not far away from here. ANT for Antioch in southern Turkey. Heraclea, H here, again near the Dardanelles, quite near Istanbul. And coins of this sort were produced of exactly the same sort throughout the empire. At the same time when all sorts of other forms of iconography and ideology became much more unified. The famous depiction, the empire had become so complicated that it needed 4 emperors to run it at once, the so-called tetrarch of Diocletian and his colleagues. And when they're depicted together in art, such as here, they're not only working together by clasping hands, as the famous porphyry statue in Venice, that I'm sure many of you have seen, but the individual features of the emperors are, as it were, suppressed, so they all look the same as a visual way of conveying they're all part of the same empire. So, where have we got to, just to bring things to a conclusion? I think the conclusion is probably so obvious it hardly needs to be stated. Despite a clear wish on the part of the Roman government to tolerate, if not actually to promote, subsidiary coinages, nevertheless, the Roman Empire did move towards a single currency in 2 entirely unrelated, both chronologically and in terms of reasoning, stages. But as I said at the very beginning, neither of which was motivated by the government. And here it seems to me we have just about the exact opposite of the historical precedent that was claimed 10, 15 years ago for the euro in relation to the Roman Empire. We might say that the Roman Emperor and his entourage, let's call it the Roman government, wasn't interested in a single currency and indeed tolerated and perhaps supported the creation of regional coinages. But in that sense, if the Roman government's position was the opposite of that of the European Commissions today, nevertheless one can draw a slightly more uncanny parallel between the two. To the debate taking place in the modern world, it seems to me the change that happened in the Western Empire in the 1st century AD is the most relevant. Monetary unions arose because of the cultural aspirations of the member states. That's to say, more or less the cities of the Roman Empire being equivalent to the cities of the Roman Empire being more or less equivalent to the modern states of Europe. Some aspired to a common system, some, such as the UK, did not. So the concluding proposition I'd offer to you at the end of this lecture is that unless it's brought about by circumstances beyond people's control, such as the disastrous inflation of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, monetary union was then, and is indeed still now, a cultural phenomenon and not an economic one. Thank you for listening.
Yes, Jersey was subject to a single currency when the Germans invaded, and it culminated in superinflation, with the euro being propped up by the International Monetary Fund. How do you see it panning out? Do you think it will have more serious disruption, civil disobedience, or do you think they'll just quietly forget it, or what do you think will happen?
You mentioned the way that the silver coinage got debased. Did the gold also get debased in the same way?
Shall I take those? Well, shall I take the second one first? The gold didn't really get debased, though just at the very end of the period I'm talking about, in the middle of the 3rd century, it did. Both the weight of it, the gold coin, declined earlier, but the purity remained the same. But at the greatest crisis in the middle of the 3rd century, both the weight and the gold content were reduced. And it was again the re-establishment of that re-established, as it were, the stability of the Roman financial system in the 4th century. Well, now, the effect of what's going on now in the end of June, I mean, I'm not sure I'm any more competent to answer that than anyone else, but we've already seen considerable civil disobedience, have we not, in some parts of Europe. And what's interesting is how few monetary unions in the past, when they've existed, have actually come to an end through anything other than invasion or some sort of direct political interference. It's very hard to find monetary unions that have been pulled apart by economic conditions. There have been part of it. For example, there was the Latin Monetary League of the late 19th century, when a number of coins of cities in Europe produced gold coins of the same weight: France, Germany, parts of Germany, Greece, and so on. And they also tried to do the same with silver, but what happened there was that the gold-silver ratio changed in the different countries, so they couldn't maintain the stability of the whole system, including the silver. So the silver fell out of the monetary union, but the gold continued. But I think what's going to happen in the rest of Europe, when I gave Barbara the title of this talk, the destruction of the euro was very much in everyone's mind. It seems to have slightly gone off a bit now, but I dare say it'll be back before too long.
Forgive my ignorance, to what extent did the Romans have a common fiscal policy, same tax rates everywhere, expenditure policies, that's much in the air these days?
Yeah. I was just asking in what ways the system of coinage differs from today, because now it's fairly universal, whereas I imagine in earlier days, there would be, for example, quite a lot of villages that might use more barter and so on. So it'd be quite interesting just to know in what fundamental ways the system and use of coinage differed from today.
No, I'm doing 3 at a time.
Oh, I see. Well, I was going to make a comment about the euro. I thought that the main problem was that you have all these different countries having the same coinage, but they haven't got the same fiscal system. And therefore, you're bound to get problems by the sheer fact that, and this is why you've got, and also, whereas I think the Roman Empire also degraded itself because they lost their philosophy and morality, and it became all luxury and obvious expenditure. And we've arrived at, with our so-called civilization, in exactly the same state, buying all these games and trinkets which have no real value and which don't add anything to life, but take an awful lot of money.
Well, I think the morality of any state, whether present or ancient, depends partly on the perspective of the viewer, and I wouldn't like to attribute the decline of the Roman Empire to moral turpitude, although you're right that people have done that from time to time. But I think the first and third questions link up very well, both about fiscal policy. One of the great debates about the Roman Empire is the degree to to which the economy was, the monetary economy was managed. And there's two different schools of thoughts: the so-called primitivists, who thinks it really wasn't managed at all much by modern standards, not much understood, and then the so-called modernists, who think it was much more sophisticated. The answer, as ever, is probably somewhere in between. We know the Roman government did have a system of budgeting. The Roman government did draw up state accounts. We don't really know anything about them other than that. We know there were common levels of tax across much of the empire, but there were also very different local taxes, and when you went from one province to another, you had to pay import taxes and so on and so forth. So it was quite a sophisticated system, but how uniform it was is not known. But nevertheless, it was able to cope with the differences between the different areas. We don't get the sort of thing because it remains one political unit, the Roman Empire. So whether or not its fiscal policy was at all developed or not, it was the same fiscal policy. And you're exactly right, that's the problem today, is you've got different states trying to use the same currency in very different economic situations and with very different fiscal policies. The second question was about the degree to which the ancient society was monetized, I think is how we'd use the word. To what extent did people use money, coins as we recognize them, to what extent they didn't. And again, there's something of a dispute about that. Now, the best sort of evidence we have about it comes from Roman Egypt, where a lot of papyri have, as I'm sure you know, have survived from antiquity, and a lot of them give details of transactions, and they show there was really quite a developed and extended monetary economy, in the sense that very small transactions could take place with money, with coins, but also sophisticated in the sense that they didn't always take place actually in coins, but there was quite a developed system of paper transfers as well. Again, people dispute exactly how much, but something of the order possibly of 40% of all transactions took place on paper rather than just with actual coins. Whereas at other parts, and more, one tries not to think of the centre and periphery as being more monetarised and less monetarised, but broadly speaking, that was the case. That if we look at the coinage, for example, found on sites in Britain, they tend to be of the larger denominations compared with sites in Italy, which tend to be a much broader range of denominations, suggesting that in Britain, coinage didn't penetrate to the same low level of transactions that it did take place in Italy. But I think the pattern would be very different from different province to different province. It's a very wide-ranging questioning. A very good audience. Well done.
Mine's just a light-hearted question regarding dates. I always thought that dates were always referred to the number of years after so-and-so emperor, but how do they refer to dates to the ordinary people of those days? You've got to pay your taxes within the next 2 years, or was there any dates mentioned at all around about this time?
Yeah, they had dates and calendars. There was a common year. There were different calendars, like there were different forms of currency in different parts of the Roman Empire, but there was the same year, and they tended to refer to by the name of the two consuls. Every year there was two consuls in charge of Rome, even in the imperial period. So it would be the names of, year of Michael and Andrew as consuls. And sometimes they would date the years from the supposed foundation of the Roman city, the city of Rome in 753 BC. Once or twice, very rarely, you get an actual date. People had birthdays too, birthday parties. So they knew a lot about dates.
Well, yes, what a note to end on, Abarbi Condita. So I'd just like to say, what I took away from this talk was fascinating, because we spent a lot of time looking at the nature of money, and one of the things I talk about is community, that a community is a group of people prepared to be indebted to one another, and that money often arises from that. So it's neither economic nor cultural, it's a bit of both. And in many ways, these fiat currencies are semi-enforced or semi-coercive currencies, and that the Roman Empire, I think, exemplifies this. And I think what Andrew's provided us today is something I think we can all dwell upon, which is a salutary reminder that money is both cultural and economic, and that no simple explanation will do. And perhaps that will help to guide us as we ourselves debate and discuss what the future holds for the euro and the pound sterling. May you all join me, please, in thanking Andrew for illuminating us today and coming up with some wonderful insights into Roman currency.
Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.